Communist Shadow, that's your book is named, and it's researching the legacy of communism on the democratic countries and how it influenced, the democracy, gender, and the economy. So really, being now in Ukraine, we're absolutely curious, what are your findings?
What we did in the book was we looked at attitudes towards sort of fundamental questions, like what citizens think about democracy, what they think about markets, what they think about social welfare, whether the state should provide social welfare, and what they think about gender equality. And what we discovered was that when you look at attitudes in post-communist countries, so former Soviet Union and East Central Europe, and you compare those attitudes towards those found in the rest of the world of citizens who are living outside of the post-communist world, we found that there was systematically less support for democracy, less support for markets, more support for state-provided social welfare, but interestingly, not more support for gender equality among post-communist citizens. So we had looked in these particular areas because we were interested in the legacies of communism. In these areas, thinking about multi-party government, states versus markets, state-provided social welfare, and social equality. These were sort of fundamental tenets of communism. So we found in 3 of these 4 cases the sort of differentials we expected. And so then the question was, what could explain for these differences? And in the book, we look at 2 sort of general classification of explanations.
Why it then happened that the people who lived through the really authoritarian regime and who have probably the victims in their families really would be so, and how it's really differences with the countries where you just have the, like Spain, France, or Chile, where you have the popular but then never kind of a governing communist movement, where you still have the sentiment. So how you explain all that?
We didn't know what we were going to find. There was a possibility it could be the opposite, right? That what you would find is a reaction to communism, and you would find a democratic surplus in more people supporting democracy in post-communist countries than you did in the rest of the world. That wasn't what the data revealed. And that's, we looked at data from, these are hundreds of thousands of interviews with people around the world over 2 decades, and we did not find that evidence that there was this surplus in support for democracy.
Exactly where the Ukrainians are sometimes surprised, where you go today for the social networks and all of a sudden have this kind of excuse for the, communism, or like not understanding why the decommunization in Ukraine is, taking place and why it's supported.
We were not comparing attitudes about communism. The way the study was set up, we needed to compare attitudes about fundamental concepts of government and politics. When we did look at sort of social welfare and attitudes towards state-provided social welfare, Ukraine was in the higher end of countries across the entire study, and it was about in the middle of the post-communist countries. So it was not the highest level for state-provided social welfare, but not the lowest level either.
We see that Russia is the country which has inherited, which kind of has inherited the Soviet legacy, and they openly speak about that. Ukraine is somewhere where, sometimes we think that we have owned it, or sometimes we sound like Ukraine was a victim and then occupied. So really, can we really somehow discuss how that could influence on also the democracy and the other things in this part of the world?
A year of exposure to communism in one country at one time is probably not the same thing as a year of exposure to communism in another country at another time. So we added in sort of all sorts of factors. We looked at like a year, was Stalinism, did exposure to Stalinism have a greater effect than, say, exposure to communism under perestroika? And apropos the question you just asked here, one of the things that we looked at was whether homegrown communism, so communist regimes that sort of came from within, so Russia, Czech Republic, places where communism, the movement kind of came from in, was different from imposed communism, wasn't basically imposed on the country. And we suspected that there would actually be a stronger effect for exposure to communism with this imposed communism, with the homegrown communism, than it would be with the imposed communism. As it turned out, that was not really the case. We found very little evidence for that, and in some cases we found the opposite evidence, where there was even stronger exposure effects in places where it was imposed than where it was homegrown, which might be suggestive of places where communism was imposed. There was maybe more generous provision of social welfare benefits to try to sort of buy over the population.
There is globally this perception that the communism were emancipated, and they were emancipating, and honestly we we should also confirm that some of the things we, the Ukrainians, when we see in some other societies, with, for instance, access to the labor and the fact, that the women in Ukraine were always working compared to some of the countries like Austria, where they were still didn't receive the pensions till end of 60s. That was pretty surprising, but still, what have you found?
Yeah, so that was what we thought. Social equality was an important part of communist doctrine. There were obviously real attempts in communist societies to try to provide for gender equality. But what we found when we looked at the data is that this surplus of support for gender equality, the way we found it in a surplus of support for state-provided social welfare, does not exist. If anything, there's actually, in the post-communist era, less support for gender equality than there is in other countries, although it's not very strong evidence in that regard. We think that there's a sort of stronger gap between rhetoric and reality in terms of gender equality than there is in these other issues. So if you think about markets, it really was, communism was state-run economies despite some variation, in individual countries. In terms of democracy, you can say what you will about rhetoric, but these really were single-party states almost exclusively. And the state did provide rather generous social welfare benefits in most cases under communism. But when you turn to gender equality, right, there was a lot of talk about gender equality, but you rarely, if ever, saw women in the Politburo. You rarely, if ever, saw women in leadership positions in industry. There was a lot of emphasis on women entering the labor market, but then there's a lot of, if you talk to people who work on this, the question was that if you may have had women in the labor market, but was labor at home, was the work in the home shared across men and women? Most of the time the answer will be no. Women were in the labor market, but they were also carrying out a great deal of responsibility at home. So we think that's one explanation, that it might be this gap between rhetoric and reality.